Hi, everyone. Welcome to our 11 a.m. session, Why AI Needs Journalism. We're joined today by our speaker, Karen Howe, Senior AI Reporter at the MIT Tech Review, and our moderator, Andrew Myrina, Product Manager at Moveworks. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Alikia. Really excited to be here. I'm going to kick things off and say good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the fourth day of the fourth annual MIT AI Conference. Whether you have been with us since Tuesday or joining us for the first time, we appreciate your attendance. My name is Andrew Myrina, and I am a product manager for an AI and machine learning company called Moveworks. I'm also a proud MBA graduate of the MIT Sloan School of Management, class of 2019, and one of the AI conference co-chairs. So really excited to see this all come together after months of planning. In today's conversation, I will be hosting a fireside chat with Karen Howe, Senior AI Reporter for the MIT Technology Review, and discuss topics that revolve around technology and journalism. So without waiting much more, let's kick things off. Karen, I think good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon, good morning to you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I'm really excited about this conversation, and just once again, on behalf of the committee, thank you for your time. Before we start, it would be great to get some background about yourself. You know, you started your career as an applications engineer for a startup that spun out of GoogleX, and then transitioned to writing for several established editorials such as Mother Jones, Quartz, and the MIT Tech Review. Can you share with us more about your journey?
Yeah, sure. So I graduated from MIT in 2015 in course 2, mechanical engineering. And we were joking right beforehand that your background of the Barker Library, I can see the spot where I used to nap between all of my classes. And at the time when I graduated, I definitely thought that I was going to take the more traditional engineering path, go into move to San Francisco, do the whole Silicon Valley dream, work at a startup. And that's essentially what I did when I graduated. And while I was doing that, I was working at this really mission-driven startup that was focused on building software for sustainable architecture. A very niche thing, but it had spun out of GoogleX kind of around the same time that Sidewalk Labs was incubating at Google, if anyone's familiar with that company. And they had very similar parallel missions. And I was at this company really loving, thinking that it was my dream job, being at a mission-driven company, working in tech, being around smart people, being around a lot of MIT people that I had gone to school with. And the thing that really bothered me or nagged me over time was I felt like the stuff that I was working on day to day, I couldn't really see how it would translate into real world impact. Either the startup, I was worried that it would go under, which unfortunately it eventually did. And there was something hard to me about waking up every morning and slaving over a product that might never come to fruition. And the other thing was I was surrounded by so many people who cared about technology, but I felt like we weren't really tackling the crux of the social issues that we see today, or the really challenging, pressing issues like climate change or hunger or poverty or social inequality, racial justice, all of these things. And so that kind of, on that journey of reflection, I started thinking more about essentially going into journalism as a way to think about these issues and write about these issues, and create a platform for more people to discuss ways that technology can serve society. And so that's how I ultimately started doing my transition in journalism, and ending up at Tech Review writing about AI. And I will say that I never really expected to write about AI. That wasn't my intention. But the thing that I really love about covering AI now is, of all of the technologies that exist in the world today, it most epitomizes all of the promises and challenges of the tech world. And so it's just a really great way for me to touch on so many topics through this particular lens that cuts across industries, that cuts across challenges. So yeah, I really love my job today.
That's amazing to hear. And I'm glad you explained the transition point because, from engineering to journalism, and it makes sense based on your shared experiences. So thank you for sharing. I want to touch upon something in February of this year. You delivered a TED Talk, which is one of my favorite pieces from your more recent work, which demonstrated your unique viewpoint in that you have a technical understanding of AI, and you use a lens that highlights the ethical impacts within society. A lot of this understanding was developed within your active role within journalism. Now, I have to ask this question because we do have builders in this audience, which is, as we look ahead now, what is your advice on building AI products?
That's a really good question. So the TED Talk that I gave in February was kind of really rooted in my own experience of always kind of straddling my love of technology and technical work and my love of thinking about social problems and philosophy and like the world and people. And I feel like one of the biggest challenges of technology, or one thing that I really strongly believe is I think a lot of challenges facing technology are rooted in the fact that we distinctly teach people that technology and humanities are fundamentally different things, and that if you are a technologist, you need to just like be really good at math, but you don't have like any imperative to understand history. Or if you're a humanities policymaker, like you should understand history, but like you're never going to understand the code. And I think that does a really big disservice to humanity because so many of our problems are social and technical problems. Like the reason why technology is powerful is because it can help solve social problems, but you need to understand those social problems in order to tackle them in the right way. And I think a lot of the problems that we see technology engender, it's rooted in the fact that it was trying to tackle something but didn't fundamentally understand what it was tackling, and then it manifests in more harm than benefit. And so I think my advice for people that are in AI or in other engineering fields that are really focused on building beneficial technologies would be to spend more time learning and developing expertise outside of the literal application of your technology to history, to social science, to anthropology, to philosophy, like all of these other things that help you better make sense of the world and contextualize how to best use your technology to make it better.
Right, and you did mention this perspective on a gender and racial lens, and I kind of want to tie that back to journalism. And we had this conversation in the past, but as this topic is about why AI needs journalism, I'm curious to know your perspective on the journey of journalism itself, since it seemed to have been initially used to inform the public. And the fact now is that we have more different perspectives in the field as it pertains to gender and the racial lens. How has that shaped or changed the field of journalism?
Yeah, one thing that part of the reason why I was thinking about this fireside through the lens or through the question of why AI needs journalism is I think that back in the day, tech journalism was much more about informing the average reader about cool things that were happening in the tech world. So it was much more of like a translation job. Like you as a person who understands technical details are trying to translate it into lay people's terms so that other people can appreciate the really exciting stuff happening at the cutting edge of different fields. At the point that we are now in, I think tech journalism has become a lot more like politics journalism, in that fundamentally politics reporters are understood to be people that hold government accountable because government has a lot of power. And tech is at the point where it has oftentimes far more power than governments now. And so a lot of tech journalism has shifted to being not just about translating technical concepts, but also calling out tech companies or calling out AI developers when they do things that are not great. And sometimes, I say calling out, but oftentimes what I really mean is I kind of try to act as a mirror to the AI field. Like I will show people, hey, like you built this technology and you were probably thinking about, you know, how beautiful your mathematical model is, how exciting it was that it worked, the accuracy, the recall, all of the different performance metrics. I get that, like I love that too. But now, like, look what happens when you applied it to the criminal justice system. Look at the fact that, you know, face recognition is now being used to infringe on people's right to protest. Law enforcement officers are using face recognition to track protesters that show up to fight causes that they believe in, and then they're being harassed. Did you mean to do that? Like, that's like the mirror that I kind of show. Like, I know you were really excited about the accuracy, but did you realize that it could be applied in these ways? And so one thing that I think a lot about is, this also ties back to another element in your question, which is like, I guess the parallels between AI and journalism. One thing that I've sort of been thinking about a lot as we've seen a lot of upheavals recently in this past year over, particularly over racial justice after George Floyd's death. The AI community has started grappling a lot with respect to face recognition on what the responsibility is of scientific fields to be advocates for particular positions. Like, can you be a scientist and also be an activist? And in the same way, the journalism field has grappled a lot with, historically, journalism is seen as an arbiter of objectivity. You're supposed to be objective. You're supposed to, like, never take sides on anything. And people have started realizing that that's like a total myth. And in order to tell the truth about things, you actually do have to uphold certain values. Like, we uphold the idea that, like, human lives are important and precious and should be protected. That's like a value baked into journalism that we uphold every day. So we should extend that to also saying, like, we uphold racial justice, we uphold, you know, giving everyone opportunities, access to education or fundamental human rights. And I'm kind of rambling a little bit now, but I think the overall point that I'm trying to make is, as a journalist, when I'm trying to uphold the AI field to account, I'm also trying to demonstrate to them that they need to hold themselves to account and demonstrate that, like, being an objective scientist is not really a thing. And doing science from a point of neutrality is also, like, not really a thing. You need to understand what like power dynamics are in society and what challenges society faces in order to actually develop technologies that redistribute power rather than concentrate power, and actually bring more benefit to more people.
Right. You know, thanks for sharing, Karen. And you highlighted the recent events. You know, you talked about George Floyd. There's a lot of other events as well throughout this year. I mean, 2020 has been remarkable. There's a lot of record high unemployment, a lot of issues that are being grappled within academic institutions. More recently, the support of our international student population and their right to go to school here. You know, I'm curious. 2020 seems to be a year in which the trajectory has changed for the field of journalism, and I'm curious. From an outsider's perspective, it does seem benign, but what is your stance on that? You kind of already highlighted that there's this notion of being anti-racist and embedding that within the field. Is there anything? Are there any other concepts that are also woven in because of what has happened in the year of 2020 going forth?
Yeah, I think 2020 has been a pretty big reckoning in the AI community, in that I think there have been like two particularly big reckonings. One is the pandemic, and people suddenly realizing that AI has, like, the dream of the field of AI is that we replicate human intelligence, and then we have this like incredible counterpart to our intelligence in helping us tackle problems that we haven't been able to tackle before, like climate change, like poverty, like hunger. And the pandemic is this perfect storm of things that the field has long promised it is working towards to solve. And one of the big reckonings of the field this year has been, it really has not done a good job in tackling most of the problems that have arisen during the pandemic. And part of it is that people have realized that they haven't really been developing the AI in the right ways to tackle these things. So early on, a lot of people started trying to develop AI systems that could help diagnose COVID and provide some kind of like rapid diagnostic triaging system. But AI, as it's currently conceived, requires an enormous amount of computation and an enormous amount of data. And when you are dealing with a novel disease, you don't have a lot of data. And in general, like having the fact that AI is built on enormous computation means that there are very few actors that can actually contribute to the research. And so you immediately slow down the progress in like an urgent pandemic-like situation. So that's been one reckoning, is like AI has gotten so detached from some of like the fundamental problems of the world that it has lost sight a little bit into how much it is actually achieving this grand ambition of making intelligence that can tackle these human challenges. I think the second reckoning of the field has been around racial justice, and the idea that that you can actually, there is this very ingrained belief in AI that like you are neutral and that algorithms are neutral and that data is neutral. And if you just are rigorous in the way that you collect data and then train your model, then like your model will, I don't know, be the truth or something. And that has also become, over the last couple of years, people have started challenging, well, there's this thing called algorithmic bias. How does algorithmic bias happen if not through ways that embedded biases within society get incorporated into AI? And this year, the conversation has progressed even further in being like, it's not just about biased data sets. It's not just about the fact that, you know, face recognition might not be able to detect Black faces as well as white faces because of data. It's also about the way that we conceive of these systems in the first place and apply these systems. Just that entire process, there are biases that get baked in. So like the idea, like why do we actually want a technology that is able to detect people extremely precisely? Are there ways that that technology can be applied to ultimately harm marginalized communities? Those conversations need to happen at the beginning. And those are like the two big reckonings within the field right now.
Wow. Yeah, right. And to follow up, so this is, you described the reckoning within 2020, and I'm curious now, as we take a step back and look more broadly, is, you know, what will be the challenges of keeping companies, individuals, governments accountable for the use of AI? And would like to hear your take on both the domestic and international challenges as well.
What would help keep them accountable? Well, the role that I see myself playing as a journalist is trying to facilitate the accountability mechanisms that already exist. So one of the ways that we keep industries accountable is the regulation. And I know in like SF regulation is this super unpopular thing, and like government officials and policymakers are often painted as people that don't know what they're talking about or don't know what they're doing. I see my role as helping government officials and policymakers understand what they're doing so that they can actually develop good regulation, because that is an important accountability measure we have. Like going back to the face recognition example, I know I keep returning back to that, but we're not saying that face recognition should never be used, because there are clearly use cases in which it is very useful. Like I open my phone every morning with some form of face recognition, Apple Face ID. But what regulation can allow us to do is have a technology that exists and can be used for both good and bad, and then limit its use so that it's only focused on the good use cases, not on the bad use cases. And so the way that I try to hold tech accountable, I suppose, is to educate and inform the policymakers, and also educate and inform voters to vote for better informed policymakers. And in the same way, I am also trying to hold government accountable to actually regulating things appropriately, because sometimes that doesn't happen, and that can also be really devastating. So making sure that if they propose regulations that are unproductive or counterproductive, or they're doing things that exacerbate some of these challenges, calling that out too, and educating, again, voters to like put pressure on them to actually change the way that they approach certain problems. I guess, what was the second part of your question? It was like national, international perspective.
Exactly. Like I feel like a lot of I mean, from me, my perspective, I've been very much seeing 2020 from the context of the US, and obviously you have seen it from US and international. And just wondering if there's a difference between what's happening here versus outside of the US.
In terms of AI and in terms of journalism, I think one thing that I guess the international perspective that I've kind of learned from looking at how this technology is being developed and how it affects people across the globe, not just in the US, is that the US is still like one of the biggest powerhouses, if not the biggest powerhouse, in developing AI technologies, and then having those technologies, trickle down to a lot of different other countries and environments. And I think people sometimes forget that the technologies that they're developing can cross so many different contexts. So an example that I'm thinking of that I actually brought up in my TED Talk is deep fakes have become like a really big thing in the past 2 years. And deep fakes were originally developed just as like generative adversarial networks, as like the class of algorithms that were developed. They were originally developed to just make computer image generation better. And Ian Goodfellow was like one of the lead researchers working on that, and he like cracked the code, and like the solution is really elegant and really beautiful. But in different contexts, it becomes pretty dangerous. So like in a good use case scenario, Hollywood now uses this technology to do some really cool CGI effects. In a bad use case scenario, I was doing my TED Talk in India, and in Mumbai, there's a journalist who a couple years back, because she was criticizing the government, someone ended up like deep faking her face onto a porn video. And it brought on so much harassment for her and so many death threats that she had to stop doing her work and like go completely offline for several months. And so I think that the international perspective that I want to bring is people should recognize that like different people living in different parts of the world with different access to resources, different cultural circumstances, or like political circumstances, they're all going to be impacted by your technologies, because digital technologies don't have borders. And when you think about the ways that your technology might benefit or harm people, always keep that in mind.
That's definitely a great message. And so we are coming to the end of our conversation, Karen, and I do want to turn to the audience here. And I want to thank Simon to ask this question for the last question of the conversation is, what are your thoughts on the credibility of journalism in the future with the apparent erosion by fake news and susceptibility to bias partially due to tech?
Susceptibility of bias partially due to tech. So I'm not sure what Simon means by the last part of that sentence, but what I will say on the first part of the question with fake news, I think that, it's a huge problem. And in the same way that technology kind of also suffers from bad actors entering their space and generating bad technologies. Journalism suffers from the same thing, where bad actors will kind of damage the reputation of journalism as a whole by doing these things in bad faith. And it's going to require a lot of work from journalists themselves, technologists who are building the platforms that help to spread fake news or stop fake news, and policymakers, regulators, to actually facilitate those changes. So it always comes back to that. And if anyone has solutions for how to improve the trust that we have in our information ecosystem, then absolutely talk to me.
Yes, well, thanks again, Karen, again, for your time, and appreciate your perspective on the topic of why AI needs journalism. I want to hand it back off to Alikia to close us out.
Sure, yeah, thank you so much
very
for your time today, Karen and Andrew, and thanks everyone for joining us. Sounds like we had a really engaged audience in session. Remember, you can always join the discussion in the MIT CNC Slack channel to continue this. If you're joining us for the next session, Practical Deep Learning, how it is used in production and already revolutionizing enterprise work, that will start in 5 minutes. So